In the quiet village of Kuru, nestled between vast forests and rolling hills, a girl named Adan was born under an ominous moon. The night she came into the world, a terrible storm raged across the land, tearing the roofs off huts and uprooting trees. The villagers, huddled inside their homes, whispered that such a birth under an angry sky could only mean one thing: Adan was no ordinary child. Old Mama Nkichi, the village's eldest storyteller, stood outside Adan's home that night, her frail body drenched in the heavy rain, her wrinkled fingers tracing strange patterns in the air. Her voice trembled as she muttered, "This child carries the eyes of fate." No one understood what that meant, but fear settled deep in the hearts of the villagers. For the first few years of her life, Adan was like any other child. She laughed, played, and ran through the fields with her friends. But as she grew older, she began to notice things that others could not see. It started subtly. At first, she thought she was imagining it. When people walked past her, she would sometimes see their footprints glowing faintly on the ground. The colors were different. Some prints shone a deep warm gold, while others flickered dimly like dying embers. At first, she thought nothing of it, assuming it was a trick of the sunlight or shadows cast by the trees. But then, something terrible happened. One morning, while fetching water from the village stream, Adan saw the footprints of an old man named Baba Oho. His steps were not golden like those of healthy men. Instead, they were dark, inky black, with small cracks forming around the edges, as though the earth itself was rejecting them. A strange, cold feeling passed over Adan, making her skin prickle. That evening, the village was shaken by eyes of grief. Baba Oho had fallen while tending his farm. By the time his family found him, his breath had already left his body. Adan stood frozen, remembering the footprints. She had seen them just hours before. Had she known he was going to die? The thought haunted her. Days passed, and the incident faded into the background of village life. But Adan could not forget. Her mind replayed the image of Baba Oho's dark footprints over and over again. Then it happened again. One evening, she saw her neighbor, Mama Ifeoma, walking down the village path, her dead in her hut. Her footprints were faded, so dim that they looked like they were barely there at all. A sense of dread filled Adan's heart, but she forced herself to believe it was just her imagination. The next morning, Mama Ifeoma was found. Adan's hands trembled as she washed her face in the river, trying to shake off the fear building inside her. The pattern was too clear to ignore. The footprints she saw weren't ordinary. They revealed something deeper, something terrifying. She had the gift of seeing the time of people's deaths. At first, Adan told no one. She was only 12, and the weight of her secret felt unbearable. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more it consumed her. Every day, she watched the people around her, terrified of what she might see. One afternoon, her best friend, Chidi, ran up to her, laughing as he showed her a small bird he had caught. But Adan's eyes immediately dropped to the ground, his footprints, dark and cracked, the same as Baba Oho's. Terror seized her heart. She grabbed Chidi's arm. "Chidi," she whispered, "don't go anywhere today. Stay inside." He frowned. "Why? I have to go to the river with my father." Adan shook her head frantically. "Please, just stay." Chidi gave her a strange look, but laughed. "You worry too much, Adan. I'll be fine." He ran off before she could say anything else. That night, a scream echoed through the village. Chidi had drowned in the river. Adan could no longer keep her secret. She rushed home, shaking, sobbing. Her mother, Mama Adaku, held her close, trying to calm her, but the fear in Adan's eyes was too deep. "Mama," she whispered, "I see when people will die." Her mother stiffened. "What did you say?" Adan told her everything. The footprints, the colors, the deaths. As she spoke, Mama Adaku's face turned pale. She gripped Adane's shoulders. "You must never speak of this to anyone," she said in a low, firm voice. "But, Mama—" "No!" Her mother's eyes were wild with fear. "If the villagers find out, they will blame you. They will say you are a witch." Adane's stomach twisted. A witch! The word alone was enough to strike fear into any child. In their village, witches were not just feared, they were hunted. So she obeyed. She swallowed her truth and pretended she saw nothing. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves. And soon, the entire village would know the terrible truth about Adane's cursed gift. Adane tried to ignore the footprints. She forced herself to look away when people walked past. She bit her lips to keep from screaming when she saw a friend's prints turn dim. She told herself that if she did not speak of it, it did not exist. But fate is not so easily denied. The deaths continued. A hunter's prints faded to a pale gray, and 2 days later, he was gored by a wild boar. An old woman's footprints became thin and cracked like dried leaves, and within a week, she passed in her sleep. Adane felt like she was suffocating under the weight of her secret. Then came the day that changed everything. The villagers were preparing for the annual Yam Festival, a time of celebration and joy. The young men competed in wrestling matches, while the women cooked massive pots of spicy soup. Children ran around laughing, their faces smeared with palm oil. For the first time in weeks, Adane felt a tiny bit of peace. Until she saw him. Chief Obina, the village leader, was walking toward the festival square, greeting his people with a proud smile. His red chief's cap sat tall on his head, and his thick beads clinked against his chest. Adane's heart stopped. His footprints. They were as black as the night sky. The earth seemed to reject them, crumbling slightly under his every step. The darkness stretched far, swallowing the ground beneath his feet. She had never seen footprints so terrifying. Cold sweat ran down Adane's back. Chief Obina was going to die. And soon. She tried to look away. Maybe it's not real. Maybe I'm wrong. But the fear in her chest refused to settle. She turned to run, but just as she did, her mother appeared beside her. "Adane," Mama Adaku said, holding a basket of fresh yam. "Come, help me carry this to the elders." Adane hesitated, her mind racing. She glanced back at Chief Obina. He was laughing loudly with the other men, his deep voice filling the air. He had no idea. He had no idea that he had only hours, maybe minutes, left to live. The thought made her feel sick. She turned to her mother, desperation in her eyes. "Mama," she whispered. "Chief Obina. His footprints. They are black." Mama Adaku's face went rigid. "Did I not tell you to stop this foolish talk?" she hissed under her breath. Adane shook her head. "Mama, please. He is going to die. We have to warn him." A sharp slap landed on Adane's cheek. Her mother's eyes were filled with terror, not anger. "You will say nothing," she commanded. "Not one word." Adane's heart pounded. "But—" Her mother grabbed her wrist tightly. "Listen to me, Adane. If you say this, they will accuse you. They will say you are the one bringing death upon the village. Do you understand me?" Tears welled in Adane's eyes, but she nodded slowly. Her mother was right. If the villagers knew what she could see, they would fear her. They would hate her. They would kill her. So she bit her tongue and stayed silent. But fate is a relentless beast. It does not wait for permission. That night, as the festival reached its peak, a terrible scream shattered the joyous air. People rushed toward the chief's hut, their lanterns swinging wildly. Inside, they found Chief Obina lying motionless on the floor, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. His skin was pale, his lips slightly open, as though he had been about to call for help. The village erupted in chaos. The women wailed, throwing themselves on the ground. The men shouted in confusion. "Who did this?" someone cried. "The chief was healthy this morning. Who has done this evil?" A deep silence settled over the crowd. Then a voice, low but certain, said, "The girl." Adana froze. Slowly, the villagers turned to look at her. The old man who had spoken stepped forward. His eyes, filled with suspicion, locked onto her. "This girl," he said. "Strange things follow her. She always knows before someone dies." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Yes," another woman whispered. "She knew before my husband passed. I saw her watching him that day." "She told Chidi not to go to the river," another man muttered, almost as if she knew what would happen. A new sound filled the night, the sound of fear turning into anger. Adan's heart pounded in her chest. She took a step back, her breath coming in short gasps. The villagers were moving closer. Their eyes, once familiar and kind, now burned with suspicion and hatred. A voice rang out. "She is a witch!" "No," Mama Adaku stepped down, her hands raised. "She is just a child." "She is not just a child," another man spat. "She knew the chief would die, and she said nothing. That is not the power of an innocent girl. That is the power of a witch." Adan trembled as the crowd grew louder. "Take her to the shrine," someone shouted. "Let the gods decide her fate." The villagers surged forward, their hands reaching for her. Adan's mother grabbed her arm. "Run!" she whispered. "Mama! Run!" With a sob, Adan turned and ran. She tore through the village, her bare feet slapping against the dirt. Behind her, the shouts of the villagers followed, torches blazing in the night. She did not know where she was running to. All she knew was that she had to get away. Her mother's voice echoed in her ears. "Run, Adan! Run!" Tears blurred her vision as she ran deeper into the forest. The trees swallowed her, their shadows stretching like long fingers in the moonlight. For the first time in her life, Adan truly understood. Her gift was not a blessing. It was a curse. And now, it had made her an outcast. A hunted child, a girl marked for death. Adan's feet pounded against the damp earth as she ran deeper into the dark forest. Her chest ached, her breath ragged, but she did not stop. Behind her, the distant shouts of the villagers still echoed, their voices filled with rage and fear. She had become a monster in their eyes. A witch! She stumbled over the roots of an ancient tree, her body crashing into the ground. Pain shot through her knee, but she bit her lip to keep from crying out. If they heard her, if they found her, she would not live to see the next sunrise. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone. The wind howled through the trees, whispering through the branches like unseen spirits. The moon hung high above, casting pale light onto the dense foliage. Strange sounds rustled in the undergrowth, things moving, watching. Adana curled into herself, trembling. She had heard the stories. The villagers spoke of the creatures that lived in the deep forest, the Indumu, the spirits of the forgotten. They were said to be the souls of those who had died unjustly, their anger keeping them bound to the mortal world. Some believed they were harmless, only whispering secrets to those who dared to listen. Others swore they were vengeful, dragging the living into the shadows, never to be seen again. Adana closed her eyes, pressing her hands over her ears, trying to block out the whispers of the wind. She did not want to hear. She did not want to know. But the truth had a way of finding her. A soft crunch of leaves made her freeze. Someone, or something, was near. She held her breath, her body tensed like a trapped animal. Slowly she lifted her head, her eyes scanning the darkness. Then she saw it. A figure stood a few feet away, barely visible in the moonlight. At first, it looked like a person. A woman, tall and slender, her hair flowing like mist. But as Adan's eyes adjusted, she saw that the woman's feet did not touch the ground. And then the woman turned. Adan let out a strangled gasp. The woman had no face, just smooth, pale skin where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Adan scrambled backward, her heart hammering. The faceless woman tilted her head as though listening, then slowly raised a single hand and pointed at Adan. And that was when Adan made the mistake of looking down. The footprints beneath the woman were unlike anything she had ever seen. They were not glowing gold like those of healthy people, nor were they dark like those of the dying. They were hollow, empty imprints that led nowhere. Cold terror gripped Adan's body. The woman stepped closer, her presence bringing an unnatural silence to the forest. The crickets stopped chirping. The wind no longer rustled the leaves. Even Adan's own breath felt stolen from her lungs. The faceless woman raised her hand again, this time pointing past Adan. Adan hesitated, her body trembling violently, but something deep inside her whispered that she should follow. Slowly, cautiously, she turned. A narrow path stretched between the trees, one she had not seen before. It was covered in footprints, hundreds, maybe thousands, overlapping each other. Some glowed softly, others flickered and faded. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. She understood. This was the path of the forgotten, the road walked by those whose deaths were unknown, whose stories had been lost. Adan looked back at the faceless woman, but she was gone. The air was heavy with the weight of something unseen, something ancient. Adan took a shaky breath and stepped forward. The moment her foot touched the path, a sharp, searing pain shot through her body. She gasped, clutching her chest, her knees buckling. Images flashed through her mind, faces she did not know, voices whispering, screaming, crying. She saw a young woman weeping by a river, her face twisted in sorrow. She saw an old man coughing blood into his hands, alone in his hut. She saw a child, barely 5, reaching for someone who was not there. She was seeing their deaths. Every forgotten soul, every unjust passing, every unanswered cry. Adan screamed. The forest trembled. The footprints beneath her swirled like smoke, wrapping around her feet, her legs, her hands. She did not know how long she was trapped in that moment, drowning in the deaths of the lost. But when she finally collapsed, her body weak, her mind overwhelmed, she knew one thing with certainty. This gift, this curse, had never been about warning the living. It was about remembering the dead. She had been chosen not to predict death. She had been chosen to carry the forgotten. Adan lay on the cold ground, shaking, the whispers of the spirits still echoing in her ears. She was no longer just a girl. She was the last witness to the footprints of the past, and the past was not yet done with her. Adan awoke to the cold kiss of dawn. The forest, which had once been filled with whispers and unseen eyes, was now eerily silent. She sat up slowly, her body aching, her mind clouded with images she could not erase. The forgotten souls. She had felt their pain, their fear, their loneliness. She had seen their deaths. Her stomach twisted. No child should have to carry such a burden, yet she knew there was no escaping it. This curse was hers alone to bear. She looked around, her eyes searching for the faceless woman, but the spirit was gone. Only the path of footprints remained. With trembling hands, she pushed herself up. She needed to leave this place. She needed to return home. But what was left for her there? The villagers had turned against her. They would never welcome her back. If she stepped into Kuru again, they would accuse her of witchcraft, and the punishment for a witch was always the same: death. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them away. She had no time for sorrow. She walked carefully, her feet silent against the damp earth. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though unseen hands were trying to pull her back. Then, through the trees, she saw the village. Smoke curled from the huts, the scent of morning fires mixing with the distant cries of children. Life had continued without her. But something was wrong. Even from a distance, she could hear the tension in the air. The village was not at peace. She moved closer, careful to stay hidden behind the trees. A crowd had gathered in the village square. Voices rose in anger. At the center of it all stood her mother. Adan's heart stopped. Mama Adaku's hands were bound, her knees pressed into the dirt. The elders surrounded her, their faces hard, their eyes burning with judgment. "This woman raised the witch," one of the elders declared. "She hid the child even after knowing her evil. She has brought misfortune upon us all." The villagers murmured in agreement. Some shouted for her to be punished. Others whispered prayers, as if the very mention of Adan's name would curse them too. Adan's stomach twisted in horror. They were blaming her mother, her beautiful, kind mother, who had spent her entire life feeding the hungry, healing the sick, and giving to those in need. She was being treated like a criminal. Adan clenched her fists. She wanted to scream, to run into the village, and tell them they were wrong, but she knew better. They would not listen. They would only see a monster. Then an old man stepped forward, the village priest. His staff, adorned with sacred beads, struck the ground with each step. His deep-set eyes carried the weight of 100 lifetimes. "This woman must face the gods," he said solemnly. "If she is innocent, let the spirits spare her. If she is guilty, let her life be taken as a sacrifice to cleanse our land." The villagers nodded. It had been decided. Adan's breath came in sharp gasps. They were going to kill her mother. Her body trembled with fear, with rage. She could not let this happen. But what could she do? She was just a girl. Just a cursed girl. Then the wind shifted. A whisper, soft as a breath, curled around her ears. "You are not alone." She froze. The trees rustled, though there was no breeze. The shadows deepened, shifting like living things. And then she saw them. Figures emerging from the edges of the village, stepping into the light. They were the forgotten. The spirits she had seen in the forest. The old man, the weeping woman, the little child. All the souls she had carried within her mind. They stood in silence, their presence undeniable, their footprints leaving no mark on the earth. The villagers gasped in horror. Some stumbled backward. "The spirits!" someone cried. The priest's face paled. His hands trembled around his staff. "This is not possible," he whispered. But it was. Adan stepped forward. She did not run. She did not hide. She walked with the forgotten. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she entered the village square. Some people fell to their knees. Others screamed. Adan did not care. She walked past them all, her eyes only on her mother. Mama Adaku's eyes widened in shock. "Adan," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. Adan knelt beside her and gently touched her bound hands. "I am here, Mama." The priest found his voice. "This child should not be alive," he hissed. "She is a curse upon our land. The spirits have come to take her away." Adan turned to him, her face unreadable. "No," she said, her voice steady. "The spirits have come because of you." A murmur spread through the villagers. The spirits did not move, but their presence spoke louder than any words. Adan pointed at the priest. "You called for the gods to decide, did you not?" The old man hesitated. "Yes," he admitted. Adan raised her chin. "Then let them speak." The spirits turned their hollow eyes upon the priest. The earth trembled beneath his feet. A sharp, terrible gasp escaped his lips. His body seized, his hands clutching at his chest. And then he screamed. The villagers watched in horror as dark, cracked footprints appeared beneath the priest's feet, identical to the ones Adan had always seen before death. The gods had spoken. The villagers began to whisper. She was never the cause. She did not bring death. She saw it. We were wrong. The priest staggered back, his breath ragged. This is a trick." but no one believed him. Because at that moment, the priest's body went still, his eyes rolling back as he crumpled to the ground. Dead. A deep silence settled over the village. Then, slowly, one by one, the villagers turned to Adan. Not with fear, not with hatred, but with awe. She had been right all along. She had not brought death. She had been its witness. Her mother was released. The villagers stepped back, shame in their eyes, unable to meet Adan's gaze. She did not say a word to them. She simply turned and walked away. Back toward the forest. Toward the only ones who had never feared her. The forgotten followed. Their footprints leaving no mark. Adan had been cast out. But she had never truly been alone. She was their keeper now. The girl who walked with ghosts. The girl who saw the footprints of death. Adan did not look back as she walked toward the trees. The village behind her was silent, watching in fearful reverence as she disappeared into the misty shadows of the forest. She knew she could never return, not truly. Even if the villagers now understood her gift, they would never look at her the same way. She had seen too much. She had become too much. The spirits moved beside her, their hollow footprints vanishing as soon as they touched the ground. They did not speak, yet Adan could feel their presence like a second heartbeat, steady and constant. She had spent her whole life fearing death. Now, death walked with her. A sharp wind blew through the trees, carrying whispers from unseen mouths. They curled around her ears, voices old and broken, pleading to be heard. My son never found my body. They killed me in secret and buried me under the tree. Tell them I was not lost. Tell them I was stolen. Adan squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands over her ears. The voices grew louder, more desperate. She could hear their pain, their unfinished stories clawing at the edges of her mind. She fell to her knees. Please, she whispered. Please, I cannot carry you all. The whispers faded, but they did not disappear. She opened her eyes and found herself standing before a massive tree, one unlike any she had ever seen. Its bark was dark and cracked, and its roots twisted like the fingers of an old, gnarled hand. Beneath it, the ground was covered in footprints. Not just the hollow ones of the forgotten, but new ones. Footprints that pulsed with gold. Adan's breath caught. These belonged to the living. And then she understood. This was a graveyard. Not one built by the villagers, but one made by those who had been taken. She touched the tree's bark, feeling the sorrow etched into its veins. This was the final resting place of those who had died without justice, murdered, abandoned, erased. The village did not know, or perhaps they had chosen not to know. Adan looked at the spirits gathered around her. Their eyes, though empty, burned with longing. They did not want revenge. They wanted truth. Slowly, she stood, her fingers tightening into fists. If she had been given this gift, this curse, then she would not waste it. She would not be silent. She turned and walked back toward the village. This time, she was not afraid. The villagers did not expect to see Adan again. When she emerged from the forest, they recoiled, some gasping in fear, others whispering prayers. But she was not alone. The spirits followed. This time the villagers saw them. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision. The air turned cold. The wind carried whispers that did not belong to the living. And then the footprints began to appear. One by one, dark hollow prints formed in the dust of the village square. Some led to huts, others to the outskirts of the land. Some circled certain people, men and women who stiffened, their faces going pale. Adan's voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent village. You call me a witch, she said, but the true darkness is buried beneath your feet. The villagers looked around, confusion and fear growing. Adan pointed toward the largest hut in the village, The hut of the chief. The forgotten are speaking, she said, and they say that their killer still walks among you. Gasps filled the air. The chief, a man with skin like polished stone and eyes that once held pride, suddenly looked as if his soul had been drained. I do not know what you are talking about, he said quickly. Adan stepped forward. Do you not? The footprints moved. They slithered across the ground, forming a path from the tree in the forest, the graveyard, to the chief's hut. And then the whispers began. Louder than ever. Fierce. Angry. You took my daughter. You cut my throat in the night. You buried us so no one would know. The villagers screamed. Some fell to their knees. Others ran. Mothers clutched their children. The chief staggered back, his eyes wild. This is madness, he shouted. You have brought evil into our land. Adan did not move. You call it evil, she said. I call it truth. The spirit surged forward. The chief let out a strangled gasp as his own footprints appeared beneath him. Dark. Cracked. Just like those Adan had seen before every death. The villagers saw it too. And at that moment, they understood. Their leader was not a protector. He was a murderer. A thief of lives. A silence heavier than the weight of the spirits settled over the village. The chief's hands shook. His breath came in shallow gasps. And then, his body crumpled. Dead. The forgotten had been heard. The village had seen the truth. And the weight of justice had been delivered. The girl who walked with death. The village never spoke of that night again. But things changed. The tree in the forest became a sacred place, a place where the lost were mourned, where their names were spoken so they would never be forgotten again. And Adan? She was never seen in Kuru again. Some say she disappeared into the woods, choosing to live among the spirits she had come to understand. Others claim she walked from village to village, revealing the truths that had long been buried, ensuring that no soul was ever lost to silence again. But one thing was certain. Wherever Adan walked, the ground bore footprints unseen by ordinary eyes. The footprints of those who had died. The footprints of those who had been forgotten. And to those who had secrets to hide, her presence was a warning. Because she would always know. She would always see. And no one, not even the living, could escape the eyes of the dead. The end.